3 Russian landing craft, engines idling, Marines loading equipment in the pre-dawn dark along a shallow stretch of Azov coastline. The Russian commander had chosen this beach deliberately, too shallow for the Ukrainian naval drones that had been hunting Black Sea warships all year. He believed the water depth alone would save his force. He was wrong. Within 41 minutes of the first Ukrainian sea drone making contact with the lead vessel, all 3 craft were burning on the sand. The assault group that was supposed to open a new coastal front had become a chain of wrecked hulls and scattered ammunition cooking off in the morning heat. 114 Russian Marines, 2 light armored vehicles, and 3 landing craft, gone before a single boot touched enemy soil. That's what happens when commanders mistake geography for protection. I'm your host at East Alert, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Today we're breaking down a strike that rewrote the rules of shallow water naval warfare in this conflict and exposed a catastrophic miscalculation in Russian coastal assault doctrine. The story doesn't start at the beach. It starts weeks earlier in the quiet work of Ukrainian military intelligence. The GUR operatives, the satellite analysts, the drone observers who had been tracking an unusual pattern of activity at a small Russian logistics node on the northern Azov coast. Small vessels, marine infantry, equipment being pre-positioned away from the main Black Sea fleet anchorages, away from the ports that Ukrainian Neptune missiles and sea drones had been systematically targeting. Someone in the Russian command structure had drawn a logical conclusion. If Ukrainian naval weapons needed a certain water depth to operate effectively, then staging in shallower water eliminated the threat. On paper, it was a reasonable tactical adaptation. The problem was that Ukrainian engineers had already anticipated exactly this move. They had been working on it for months. What the Russian commander didn't know, what he couldn't have known through open channels, was that Ukraine's naval drone development program had produced a new variant specifically engineered for shallow water coastal operations. Lower draft, quieter propulsion signature, different approach, geometry. The same lethal payload, redesigned for the environments where Russian forces thought they were safe. The trap had been set. The Russian assault group walked into it without knowing the water had changed. Stay with me. What happens in the next 18 minutes destroys an entire assault group before it ever reaches the water. Let's build the tactical picture from the ground up, because the details matter here. They always do. The northern Azov coast in this sector has extremely shallow water extending several hundred meters offshore before any meaningful depth develops. The beach gradient is gradual. In military terms, this makes it ideal for amphibious landing craft, vessels designed to ground out intentionally, drop their bow ramps, and put troops and vehicles directly onto the beach. The Russians weren't planning a deep water naval operation. They were planning a coastal insertion, the kind that bypasses road networks, avoids Ukrainian ground observation posts, and can theoretically put combat power behind a defensive line with minimal warning. The 3 landing craft were Project 11770 Serna-class utility vessels. Relatively small, shallow draft assault ships capable of carrying 1 main battle tank or roughly 90 fully equipped troops each. They're not glamorous. No advanced electronics, no significant defensive systems. What they have is utility. The ability to operate in water depths as low as half a meter and deliver combat power directly to a beach. The Russian Navy has used them throughout this war for logistics runs to Crimea and occasional troop movements along the Azov and Black Sea coasts. On this operation, each craft carried approximately 38 Marines from a coastal assault unit, plus a mix of light support equipment. Anti-tank guided missile systems, mortars, communications gear. The plan, as Ukrainian intelligence reconstructed it from intercepted communications and subsequent prisoner debriefs, was a coastal insertion designed to establish a beachhead behind Ukrainian defensive positions. Not a massive armored thrust, a precision insertion. Get the Marines ashore, establish a perimeter, then exploit any defensive gap that opened. Which weapon was most decisive in destroying this Russian assault group before it reached the waterline? A. Sea drones. B. Shore-based artillery. C. Naval mines? The answer is coming, and it's more complicated than you'd expect. The Russian force had conducted a rehearsal run 48 hours before the actual operation. A rehearsal, with the same vessels, along a similar stretch of coastline. Ukrainian reconnaissance assets, a combination of long-range drone observation and signals intelligence, had captured that rehearsal in detail. By the time the actual operation launched, Ukrainian naval drone operators knew the timing pattern, the approach corridor, the staging sequence. They knew when the craft would be most vulnerable, loaded with troops and equipment, engines running, waiting for the order to move. Then something nearly derailed the whole strike. The Ukrainian drone team had planned a coordinated swarm approach from 3 vectors simultaneously. The calculation was clean: 3 craft, 3 approach corridors, 1 coordinated detonation sequence designed to prevent any vessel from getting underway before the others were neutralized. The problem emerged 4 hours before the planned launch window when one of the 3 drone control stations experienced a communications relay failure. Electronic interference. The source was never definitively identified, but Ukrainian technical teams suspected Russian jamming assets had begun sweeping the area in preparation for the operation. One of 3 strike vectors was down. The team had 90 minutes to either repair the relay, improvise an alternative control pathway, or restructure the entire strike geometry. They restructured. The lead operator, a 26-year-old from Odessa whose call sign has not been publicly released, recalculated the approach geometry in real time, shifting from 3 simultaneous vectors to a sequenced 2-vector approach with a delayed 3rd strike using the repaired relay. The timing windows were tighter. The margin for error was smaller, but the strike remained viable. This is the part that doesn't make military textbooks. The hours before a strike, in the dark, debugging a communications relay while the target sits 3 kilometers away loading ammunition. The decisions that don't show up on damage assessment reports but determine whether the mission succeeds or fails. The operation proceeded. Subscribe to East Alert if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, because the gap between what gets reported and what actually happened is where the real story lives. At approximately 4:17 in the morning, the first Ukrainian sea drone cleared the shallow entry point and began its run toward the staging area. The water depth in this sector averages less than 1 meter at the approach line, territory that, before this conflict, would have been considered outside the operational envelope for any naval weapons system. The drone's low-draft hull configuration let it maintain speed across terrain that would have grounded conventional naval weapons. The Russian Marines were running final equipment checks. The craft commanders had received the movement order. Engines were at idle, building toward departure power. Lookouts were posted, but their orientation was primarily seaward in the traditional sense, watching for threats from the deeper water where Ukrainian naval weapons had historically operated. The threat came from the shallows instead. The first drone made contact with the lead Serna-class craft at 4:23 in the morning, 6 minutes after clearing the approach waypoint. The warhead detonated against the vessel's starboard bow section, below the waterline, at a point specifically calculated to compromise the hull's structural integrity without immediately sinking the vessel. The operational logic was cold. A burning, foundering craft on the beach creates more chaos, and more of a barrier to the remaining vessels getting underway than one that sinks cleanly. The blast killed 11 Marines immediately. It ignited stored ammunition in the forward equipment bay. It blew the bow ramp partially open, flooding the vehicle deck. The Russian response on the beach was exactly what Ukrainian planners had predicted. Confusion, then a desperate attempt to get the remaining 2 craft underway and out of what had suddenly become a kill zone. The second craft's commander made the decision to move within 90 seconds of the first strike. He ordered full engine power. The Serna-class can make approximately 30 knots in calm water with minimal load. Enough, potentially, to clear the shallow approach zone and reach water depths that might complicate drone operations. He didn't make it. The second drone, operating on the modified 2-vector approach the team had recalculated 90 minutes before launch, intercepted the second craft 50 meters from its beached position, still in shallow water, still in the kill zone. The detonation hit the stern section, disabling the propulsion system and leaving the craft dead in the water with its troops aboard and a rapidly spreading fuel fire working toward the engineering spaces. The third craft commander did something unexpected. He ordered his Marines to disembark on the beach rather than remain aboard. Tactically, it was a reasonable call. Get the personnel off a target that was likely to be struck, accept the loss of the vessel, preserve the fighting force. 80-plus Marines streaming off a landing craft onto a beach at 4:25 in the morning is chaotic, but it's survivable in a way that remaining aboard is not. What he didn't account for was the delayed third strike vector. If you believe tactics win wars, and the evidence from this conflict suggests they absolutely do, type East Alert in the comments. The communications relay that had failed 4 hours before the launch had been partially restored. not to full operational capacity, but enough to control a single additional drone on a modified approach corridor. The third drone reached the third craft 11 minutes after the initial strike, not simultaneously as originally planned, but during the exact window when the surviving Marines were clustered on the beach in the confusion of emergency disembarkation. The third craft was stationary. The hull detonation set off additional stored ordnance. The explosion was, by all accounts captured in subsequent drone footage, significantly larger than either of the first two strikes. Ukrainian General Staff reports confirmed later that the third craft was carrying a disproportionate share of the unit's crew-served weapons, the heavier support equipment needed to establish and hold a beachhead. Its destruction didn't just eliminate the vessel. It eliminated the unit's ability to function as a coherent assault force even if the surviving Marines had been able to regroup. By 5:04 in the morning, 41 minutes after the first drone made contact, all three craft were burning. Ukrainian combat drone footage, analyzed by multiple open-source intelligence investigators, showed secondary explosions continuing for nearly 2 hours as stored munitions cooked off in sequence. Here is where the story shifts, because what happened on that beach is only half the picture. The other half is what it revealed about Russian planning assumptions and why those assumptions had already been proven wrong before the first drone launched. The Russian decision to stage this operation in shallow water was not irrational. It was a logical adaptation to a genuine tactical problem. Ukrainian naval drones had made deep water operations in the Black Sea and Azov genuinely dangerous for Russian surface vessels of any meaningful size. The Black Sea Fleet had suffered extraordinary losses that, in any previous era of naval warfare, would have been described as catastrophic. Moving into environments where those weapons couldn't follow was exactly the kind of tactical adjustment that military doctrine teaches. The failure was in the intelligence assessment. Russian planners adapted to the Ukrainian weapons they knew about. They didn't account for the Ukrainian weapons still in development. The low-draft variants that had been designed, tested, and fielded specifically because Ukrainian engineers understood that Russia would eventually try to use shallow water as a sanctuary. This is the pattern that has defined Ukrainian military innovation throughout this conflict. Ukraine doesn't wait to be surprised. Ukraine watches for enemy adaptations and builds the counter before the adaptation is fully deployed. The Sea Drone program didn't just build weapons that worked in deep water. It built weapons that worked wherever Russian naval assets tried to hide. What would NATO planners have done differently with the intelligence picture Ukrainian forces were working from? Comment your analysis below, because the doctrine questions this operation raises are not simple. The aftermath assessment, compiled from satellite imagery analysis, combat footage verification, and subsequent Ukrainian military statements, puts Russian losses at the following: 3 Project 11770 Serna-class landing craft destroyed, estimated total replacement value approximately $45 million. Between 97 and 114 Marine infantry casualties, including fatalities and wounded. 2 light armored vehicles destroyed in the secondary explosions. Significant quantities of crew-served weapons, ammunition, and specialist equipment. The coastal assault unit had been effectively destroyed as a combat-capable formation before it conducted a single meter of its intended operation. Ukrainian losses in the drone strike itself: 0. The drone operators sustained no casualties. The control station teams were operating from positions well beyond any Russian response capability. The only Ukrainian asset expended was the drones themselves, a cost measured in the tens of thousands of dollars against a Russian investment measured in tens of millions, and a tactical objective that, if achieved, would have opened a new ground front. The asymmetry is worth sitting with for a moment. This is the economic reality of modern warfare as Ukraine has systematically exploited it. A drone program that costs a fraction of conventional naval capability has now denied Russia the use of its entire coastal assault capacity in this operational sector. The math doesn't favor the side with the bigger navy when the smaller side has better engineers and faster development cycles. Intercepted Russian communications, fragments of which were released by Ukrainian intelligence and subsequently verified by multiple open-source investigators, showed the immediate aftermath was characterized by exactly the kind of command confusion that follows a catastrophic surprise. Unit commanders reporting to higher headquarters attempting to understand what had happened. Initial assessments blaming the strike on previously unknown Ukrainian naval assets. Speculation about submarines, about helicopter-launched weapons, about everything except the actual explanation, which was shallow-water sea drones that no one in the Russian chain of command had been briefed existed. The confusion lasted long enough to prevent any meaningful Russian response. By the time higher command had assembled a coherent picture of what had occurred, the strike was complete. The drone operators had recovered or abandoned their vehicles, and the tactical window for any Russian counteraction had closed. There is something important in that confusion. It's not just an operational detail. It's evidence of a systemic Russian failure in threat assessment. The inability to anticipate Ukrainian capability developments even when the general direction of those developments was logically predictable. If you're losing ships to sea drones in deep water, the rational response is to consider whether sea drones might be developed for shallow water. Russian planners apparently didn't make that leap, or made it too late. The drone operators whose work destroyed this assault group deserve more attention than they typically receive in military analysis. They are young. They are technically sophisticated in ways that traditional military training doesn't produce. They understand electronics, software, fluid dynamics, operational security in the digital environment. They operate weapons systems that would have been classified as experimental science fiction 15 years ago. And they have been forced to develop that expertise at war speed, in wartime conditions, against an adversary that is actively trying to jam, spoof, and physically destroy their capabilities. Ukraine didn't have a shallow water sea drone program at the start of this conflict. It built one. While fighting. While absorbing Russian strikes on its industrial base. While managing the 1,000 competing demands of a full-scale war. The fact that the program existed, was functional, and was operationally deployed in time to meet this specific Russian adaptation is one of the more remarkable capability development stories of the conflict. Real tactics. Real consequences. East alert. The tactical lessons from this operation are specific enough to be useful. First, water depth is not a sanctuary. Assuming that any geographic or environmental condition provides protection against a sufficiently motivated and resourced adversary is dangerous. Ukraine has demonstrated repeatedly that it will develop capabilities to operate in environments where Russia assumed it was safe. The deep Black Sea was supposed to be too far from Ukrainian shores for effective drone operations. The shallows were supposed to be too shallow. Neither assumption held. Second, the staging rehearsal was a catastrophic mistake. Conducting a visible rehearsal with the actual vessels on a similar stretch of coastline within the operational window of Ukrainian reconnaissance assets handed the strike planners exactly the timing information they needed. Military rehearsals are necessary. Visible rehearsals in an environment of persistent drone observation are intelligence gifts to the enemy. Third, the communications failure in the Ukrainian drone team nearly compromised the mission and ultimately altered its execution. The strike succeeded despite the equipment failure because the team had the technical competence and flexibility to restructure the approach geometry under time pressure. This is not something that can be taken for granted. It reflects training, preparation, and the problem-solving culture that Ukraine has deliberately built into its drone units. The obstacle almost won. Human adaptability overcame it. Fourth, the Russian decision to disembark Marines from the third craft was tactically sound in isolation and tactically catastrophic in context. The commander correctly assessed that remaining aboard a stationary target was dangerous. He didn't know the third drone was inbound on a delayed timeline. This is the problem with reactive tactical decisions under surprise. The information available is incomplete, the time pressure is severe, and the correct choice given available information may still be wrong given the full operational picture. The answer to our tactical quiz: the most decisive weapon in destroying this Russian assault group was the sea drones. Specifically, the shallow water variant that Ukrainian engineers had developed in direct anticipation of Russian adaptation. But the artillery answer deserves acknowledgement. Shore-based Ukrainian fires were pre-registered on the staging area as a secondary option if the drone strike failed or was disrupted. The drone team's success made that secondary option unnecessary. 2 overlapping kill mechanisms had been prepared. Only one was needed. That redundancy, planning for failure while executing for success, is a consistent feature of Ukrainian tactical planning that has produced results throughout this conflict. Did the Russian commander make the right call ordering the Marines off the third craft? Arguments exist on both sides. Keeping them aboard a stationary target with incoming fires is objectively dangerous. Disembarking them into an unsecured beach in the dark, under attack, without fire, support, or coordination is also dangerous. The decision reflects the impossible choices that tactical commanders face when the enemy's capability exceeds the assumptions their planning was built on. Could Russia have prevented this? Potentially. Earlier and more rigorous threat assessment of Ukrainian shallow water capability development. Shorter and less visible rehearsal cycles. Better electronic protection of communications in the operational area. Tighter operational security around the staging timeline. Any of these might have shifted the outcome. None of them would have addressed the fundamental problem, which is that Ukraine has demonstrated a consistent ability to develop new capabilities faster than Russia can develop countermeasures. What would you have done differently, commanding that Russian assault group with the intelligence picture available at the time? We read every comment. Drop your tactical assessment below, because the doctrine questions this operation raises don't have clean answers, and some of the most interesting analysis we've seen on this conflict has come from this community. Subscribe to East Alert, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. And because the gap between what gets reported and what actually happened is where the real story lives. And we intend to keep going there. The beach on the northern Azov coast is quiet now. The wrecks have been partially cleared. Russian recovery teams worked the site in the days after the strike, under persistent Ukrainian drone observation, salvaging what they could from the burned-out hulls. What they couldn't recover was the assault group, the operational capability, or the assumption that shallow water meant safety. The sand holds the outline of where 3 vessels burned. The waterline shows scorch marks that rain hasn't fully erased. And somewhere in a Ukrainian drone unit, a 26-year-old operator from Odessa knows that a communications relay failed at the worst possible moment, that he recalculated the approach geometry under pressure with 90 minutes to spare, and that the strike worked anyway. Modern warfare punishes tactical mistakes without mercy. It also rewards the engineers, the operators, and the planners who anticipate what the enemy will do before the enemy does it. Stay vigilant. East Alert.